These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. German airline Lufthansa once rolled full beer kegs down the aisle and served fresh draft beer to passengers in the 1960s. It was part of a brief golden age when flying was sold as a flying restaurant with real glassware and table service. In 1954, a couple in Texas held their wedding underwater in a glass-walled marine theater, breathing through hoses between vows. Guests, flowers, and even the rings were submerged, turning the San Marcos show into one of the strangest weddings of the decade. This taxi in the early 1960s American South was marked colored only, showing how transport was divided by law. Such cars are a stark reminder that legal segregation in daily life existed in the United States only a few decades ago. Early line workers in the United States in the 1910s balanced on open wires high above the trees with almost no safety gear. These men were helping build the young telephone and power network that would soon connect the whole country. A whole room of finished Santa figures posed together in 1920, wrapped in heavy fur coats and long beards. Many of these men worked as holiday performers in villages and cities, bringing the new, modern Santa image to Finland's winter celebrations. Magician Larry Jones turned his Michigan living room into a full stage in 1962, floating his wife in mid-air while the children watched. Even the furniture became props for home magic shows, from the hanging ring seat to the rolling illusion box. In 1966, people in Washington, D.C. threw bags of paint at President Lyndon Johnson's limousine during a protest against United States policy in Vietnam. The splattered car shows how strong public anger over the distant conflict had become by the mid-1960s. In 1929, a logging truck in Buffalo, New York, lost control, and a huge timber went straight through this small car. The eerie photo shows how close early road travel could come to disaster with almost no protection for drivers. In November 1917, workers and city militia in Russia took up rifles in the streets during the unrest of the revolution. This scene shows one of the first moments when old police forces and new revolutionary units faced each other in open armed confrontation. An American A-20 Havoc roars over a Japanese airfield in the Pacific, dropping parachute bombs while smoke rolls across the ground, around 1943 to 1945. Below, a wrecked Japanese plane painted with wild camouflage lies exposed, proof of how low-level raids tried to wipe out enemy aircraft before they could even take off. Group of Orthodox priests sit as defendants in a Petrograd courtroom in June 1922. The large trial was linked to Soviet efforts to take church valuables for state use after the revolution. In 1986, math teachers in the United States marched with signs to protest the use of calculators in grade school classes. They argued that early calculator use would stop children from learning basic number skills by hand. Replica sandals from ancient Greece displayed in a Prague museum have metal studs on the sole that spell a mirrored message, meaning, "Follow me." When the wearer walked on soft ground, the letters printed this line into the earth, turning every footprint into a moving advertisement. Massachusetts state police officer stands by a patrol car fitted with an early radar speed checker in the 1950s. Devices like this let officers measure driver speed from the roadside instead of pacing cars on the highway. New York City shop owners and workers pose in doorways and windows around 1865. The buildings are covered with painted signs for printers, carpenters, painters, and drug brokers, showing how small businesses advertised before modern billboards. German leader Adolf Hitler meets Czech President Emil Hácha in Berlin on 15 March 1939, hours before German troops move into the rest of Czechoslovakia. Under heavy pressure and in poor health, Hácha signs an agreement that places his country under German control. A United States 25th Division tank fires a flame weapon at a hillside bunker position near the Han River in Korea on March 30, 1951. The bright stream up the slope shows how tanks were used at close range to clear fortified positions during the Korean War. Firefighters in New York City move through hoses and smoke while carrying an injured worker during the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire on March 25, 1911. The tragedy pushed lawmakers to create stronger workplace safety rules and modern fire codes in the United States. In 2003, Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan fell from a horse while opening a new park in Istanbul. Security staff rushed in as he hit the sand of the small rodeo arena in front of cameras. Stone quarries on the outskirts of Paris, known as the American Quarries, photographed in 1878. A later legend claimed stone from here went into the Statue of Liberty, even though the monument itself was built from metal. A police officer in the United States stands beside a robed member of the Black Legion, a secret group that split from the Ku Klux Klan in 1936. The organization was later exposed and broken up after criminal trials over threats and illegal actions against black citizens. A San Francisco court holds a session outdoors in 1918 with tables set up in a public square beside a Robert Louis Stevenson monument. Open-air hearings were used during the influenza pandemic as a safety measure to lower the chance of infection in crowded rooms. Soviet soldier Bakretdin Kakimov in 1980 when he was reported missing in Afghanistan and later listed as dead. In 2013, he was found alive in Herat under a new name, working as a local healer and no longer speaking Russian. Men carry out a quiet currency exchange in East Berlin in 1953, captured by photographer Ralph Crane. In a bomb-damaged empty lot, they trade Western money despite strict state rules on foreign currency. A Soviet courtroom in 1943 holds one of the first war crimes trials of the Second World War, with 11 Russian and Ukrainian collaborators in the dock. All were found guilty of treason, with some sent to labor camps and others receiving capital sentences under wartime law. Actress Janet Gaynor holds her trophy after winning Best Actress at the first Academy Awards in 1929. She received the prize for her performances in the films Seventh Heaven, Street Angel, and Sunrise. Che Guevara in 1966 passport photos under the alias Ramon Benitez Hernandez, a supposed middle-aged Uruguayan businessman. With this false document, he entered Bolivia quietly under his new identity. Police in Birmingham, Alabama used dogs to push back a young black protester during a civil rights march in September 1963. Photos like this spread across the United States and helped build support for new civil rights laws. Japanese prisoners of war stand behind barbed wire with heads bowed as they listen to Emperor Hirohito's radio message in August 1945. The broadcast announces that Japan will accept Allied terms and end its role in the Second World War. Cambodian soldiers display captured young prisoners during the Civil War in 1974. Many detainees in scenes like this faced harsh treatment and did not survive the conflict. Christmas celebration in Badagry, Lagos, Nigeria in 1923, with men standing in rows so painted letters on their chests spell 1923 Badagry Merry Xmas. A South Vietnamese officer questions a captured woman near Tam Khai, north of Saigon, in November 1967. The soldier's rifle held close to her head shows how tense and aggressive village searches for Viet Cong supporters could become. Sniper codenamed Arrow prepares her rifle in a safe room in Sarajevo on June 30, 1992, during the city siege. The 20-year-old Serb fighting for Bosnian government forces said she had long lost count of how many times she had fired at enemy positions. A skull is set on a stick outside a shelter used by United States soldiers in the Vietnam War on 25 October 1968. The eerie display shows how some frontline troops tried to scare opponents in the thick jungle. Crowds gather in the town square of Easton, Maryland in the 1850s to watch an auction of enslaved people. The image shows how public and accepted this system was in parts of the United States before the Civil War ended it. A mother and father pose with two pairs of newborn twins in a British studio in the 1860s. Multiple sets of twins in one family were rare enough that photographers often recorded them as curiosities of the time. Betty Ford dances barefoot on the cabinet room table at the White House on her last day as First Lady in 1977. The playful photo became a symbol of her open, informal style in Washington. In 1920s and 1930s Los Angeles, shops were built in shapes like grand pianos, coffee cups, and flower pots to advertise what they sold to passing drivers. This programmatic or mimetic roadside architecture was an early form of giant 3D billboard, and most of these buildings have since disappeared. Women from a licensed entertainment district sit behind a barred window in Japan around 1890. Passers-by watch from the street as this type of display let future clients choose a companion from outside. Children in traditional dress hold a banner reading, "God Save America from Communism," in Boston in 1950. The small march reflects early Cold War anxiety in the United States about communist ideas spreading. Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena flee by helicopter from the party headquarters in Bucharest during the Romanian Revolution in 1989. Their escape lasted only a short time before the helicopter was forced down, and they were arrested by the army. Lancashire factory workers relax on stacks of freshly made asbestos mattresses in 1918. At the time, asbestos was praised as a miracle fireproof material, and its serious health risks were still unknown. Actress Belle Bilton poses in costume for a stage production of Beauty and the Beast in 1889. She later became famous as Lady Dunlow after her highly publicized marriage to an Irish nobleman. An American soldier sits on a hillside ledge, smoking a pipe, while looking down at the German town of Cochem on January 9, 1919. The steep vineyards and hilltop castle show how close frontline troops were now living to old Rhine Valley landscapes after the First World War armistice. The Japanese aircraft carrier Soryu sits in dry dock at Kure while workers complete her fitting out in early 1937. The unfinished hull shows the size of the new carrier that would later serve in the Pacific War. The first concrete and steel sarcophagus around Chernobyl reactor number 4 is seen completed near Pripyat in December 1986. This emergency shelter was built after the nuclear accident to limit further release of radioactive material until a larger cover could be constructed. Boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter and John Artis leave the courthouse in handcuffs after being found guilty in Paterson, New Jersey on May 27, 1967. Their case later became one of the most debated criminal convictions in United States history. Middleweight boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter stands with police outside a car in Paterson, New Jersey after a late-night incident in June 1966. He was later convicted in a highly disputed case, and his convictions were overturned many years afterward. A long column of German prisoners of war marches down a road outside Metz, France, in November 1944. The scene was captured for Life magazine by photographer Ralph Morris as Allied forces advanced through eastern France. A Polish family stands on a rocky hillside in the Soviet interior after being deported from occupied Poland during the Second World War. Between 1.5 and 2 million Polish citizens were sent east by Soviet authorities after the September 1939 invasion. The experimental landship war tank America was built in 1918 by engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and funded by wealthy Bostonians to claim the title of largest tank. On its first trial, it managed about 16 miles near Boston, broke down. A dancer performs at London's first officially licensed adult cabaret club in 1968. Men sit just a few steps away, watching this new kind of night entertainment become part of the city's nightlife. A smiling nun flashes a peace sign near parked cars at the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. Some members of religious communities came to the event as visitors and observers, curious about the new youth culture. Traveling circus performers pose for a group portrait in Samarkand in the 1890s, then part of the Russian Empire. Their drums, costumes, and shaved heads hint at acrobatic and street shows along the old Silk Road routes of Central Asia. A horse-drawn wagon converted into a field house of pleasure for officers, photographed in the 1910s. These mobile recreation huts followed the Army so tired officers could rest, drink, and briefly escape life at the front. Two children play in a simple wooden room in 1949, one riding a homemade rope swing fixed to the ceiling. The rough floorboards and single doll on the ground show how little was needed to turn a bare room into a playground. General Dwight D. Eisenhower walks past an overturned German Tiger tank after the Battle of Chambois in France, 1944. As Supreme Allied Commander, he toured wrecked armor and battlefields to see the results of the Normandy campaign firsthand. Union soldiers of the Army of the Potomac scuffle over a bottle of wine near Falmouth, Virginia, in April 1863. The photo was taken behind the lines during the American Civil War, showing bored troops stirring up chaos in camp. People bend over trash cans on a city street in 1935, searching for scraps during a hard food shortage. This quiet moment shows how the global economic crisis turned ordinary towns into places where leftovers could mean survival. People bend over trash cans on a city street in 1935, searching for scraps during a hard food shortage. This quiet moment shows how the global economic crisis turned ordinary towns into places where leftovers could mean survival. These metal stamps from the 19th century were used to mark enslaved people with simple letters and symbols. Their neat shapes, some even like hearts, actually stood for human ownership made to last. This photo shows the inside of the Statue of Liberty's face in the 1870s, when the huge copper mask still lay in a workshop. Before she crossed the ocean to New York, workers built her like a metal puzzle, fixing thin copper plates to a hidden iron frame no visitor ever sees. Nuns from the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet wear gas masks in 1942 while training for a possible air raid during World War II. The calm habits and strange masks make their convent lawn look more like a scene from a silent science fiction film than a safety drill. In 1962, a man sits handcuffed in a New York room with rifles and neat rows of wrapped packets laid out on the table beside him. Police said he had carried this hidden illegal cargo from France on a luxury ocean liner, turning a glamorous voyage into an arrest scene. In 1969 in Northern Ireland, an Irish man leans over a wall and fires a simple slingshot at a British armored vehicle in the street below. The tiny strip of rubber against heavy steel became a strange symbol of how uneven and close to home this conflict was. Berta Libicki poses for her Nebraska penitentiary photo in 1903, her number perched on her head like a strange little hat. In busy city crowds, she was known for suddenly fainting into the arms of wealthy men, then calmly walking away with their wallets before they knew what had happened. Kurdish fighters stand in a bare room in 1991, while captured Iraqi soldiers line up beside them after a sudden local uprising. For a short time that year, scenes like this appeared across northern Iraq as Kurdish groups briefly pushed government forces out of many towns. In 1956, two bruised robbery suspects sit in a New York station while a line of officers stands behind them, one calmly unloading a pistol beside a suspect's face for the camera. Their failed attempt to hold up a Manhattan restaurant ended not with quick money, but with this staged. In 1914, craftsmen in a European workshop sculpted life-size dummy heads to lure enemy sharpshooters into revealing their positions. Soldiers would slowly raise these fake faces above the trench line, watching where the bullets hit before it was safe for a real person to look out. Astronaut Ronald McNair calmly plays his saxophone while floating in zero gravity aboard the space shuttle in 1984. He even planned to record the first sax solo from space for a jazz album, turning the shuttle into a tiny orbiting music studio. During a 1957 Cold War drill in California, a paratrooper playing the role of a Soviet soldier ended up dangling in a park tree with his chute wrapped in the branches. For a few hours that day, an ordinary public garden became a mock battlefield. On December 5, 1933, huge crowds flood an American street to celebrate the end of the national ban on legal drinks. After 13 years of secret bars and police raids, people could finally raise a glass in public again, and they wanted the cameras to see it. In 1962, Moscow residents gathered to watch cranes drop whole apartment rooms into place like giant building blocks. These early prefabricated houses could rise in just days, promising a fast new home for thousands of city families. In 1938, in the Netherlands, a group of men gather around a table as a nurse uses a baby doll to show them how to weigh and hold an infant. These early fatherhood lessons challenge the idea that only mothers should learn child care. In 1922, off the coast of Germany, this heavy metal diving suit is lowered from a boat, like a small human-shaped submarine. Its stiff-jointed arms and round body let divers walk on the seabed under huge pressure long before modern scuba gear existed. In 1938, this test pilot walks across a field sealed inside an early pressure suit designed for flights into the stratosphere. The bulky helmet and tangled hoses were a first step toward the sleek spacesuits that would one day fly beyond the atmosphere. Young Arnold Schwarzenegger lifts actress Sally Field in a playful kiss during a break from filming in 1976. Long before superhero movies, the future action star was already turning romance into a strength show, holding her up as easily as a barbell. These are police portraits of real Peaky Blinders members in Birmingham in 1903, long before the television series made them famous. The young men in flat caps were said to sew razor blades into the brims and built a street empire on betting, theft, and strict loyalty codes. On April 21, 1972, the lunar module Orion and the rover rest on the quiet surface while Apollo 16 Commander John Young works nearby. During this mission, he and Charles Duke drove more than 26 kilometers across the moon. Two Soviet soldiers pause by a milestone that reads 30 kilometers from Berlin in the final weeks of World War II. Behind this simple stone marker, millions knew that the long and brutal road across Europe was almost at its end. In 1934, a worker in New York inspects huge stacks of wooden crates stamped Vodka USSR inside a chilly warehouse. This mountain of bottles shows how quickly Soviet drink shipments began filling American docks after the end of the national ban. This Texas city bus in the 1950s shows racial segregation in daily life, with white riders seated at the front and African American riders pushed to the back. Scenes like this soon helped spark the civil rights movement, as passengers began to quietly refuse those rules. In 1938, this simple Korean warehouse housed Samsung Sangho, a small trading company dealing in dried fish and fruit. From this modest storefront, the brand that would later fill the world with televisions and smartphones quietly took its first steps. This 1938 portrait shows a person from an Indonesian tribe whose teeth have been carefully filed into pointed shapes. In some island communities, reshaped teeth were a traditional sign of beauty, status, or courage, so every smile carried a hidden message. In 1983, Boston bartenders lean over a replica sailing ship and pour bottles of Soviet vodka into the harbor during a noisy protest. They stage this liquid boycott as a modern echo of the Boston Tea Party after a Korean passenger flight was lost in an international incident with the Soviet Union. Children play in a dusty street of low shacks and a lone minaret in Dubai in 1976, long before the city's famous skyline appeared. In just a few decades, this modest Gulf town would turn into a forest of glass towers, malls, and wide highways. In January 1980, soldiers in southern Rhodesia happily pose with women's underwear that arrived by mistake in a supply drop meant for a female unit. A serious air mission turned into an unplanned comedy show on the parade ground. In 1920 in Canada, an inventor calmly sits inside his new concrete pipe while workers stack a mountain of sandbags and even climb on top to test it. This human stress test showed buyers that the pipe could hold many tons of weight without cracking. Special effects artist Tom Savini casually sips coffee while a rubber creature leans over his shoulder on the set of From Dusk Till Dawn in 1996. In 1987, a Soviet guard walks past giant rocket sections lined up to be cut apart under a new disarmament agreement with the United States. For the first time in the Cold War, both sides were not just limiting weapons, but actually slicing them up and sending the metal back to normal industry. In February 1996 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, American and Russian peacekeepers stand by a vehicle and swap field rations like gifts. For soldiers who once trained as rivals, trading food became a small daily sign that they were now on the same side of keeping the peace. In 1973 in Delaware, a student and a teacher sit on folding chairs at the school entrance, calmly holding a long gun while the town reports possible trouble nearby. This prototype motorcycle carries one of the first 6-cylinder engines ever tested on 2 wheels, so big it nearly hides the rider. Engineers bolted a full car-sized power unit into a stripped frame just to see how much speed a human body could handle. German soldiers on the Western Front in 1939 pose for a joke photo, writing "West Front 1939" across a comrade's backside. During the so-called quiet first months of the conflict, many frontline units spent more time waiting and fooling around like this than actually fighting. A former ballet dancer selling flowers in Moscow drops into a full split on the street at age 60 in 1960. Her market stall may be modest, but her flexibility still belongs on a theater stage. In 1913, 19-year-old Tom Lyle Williams mixed coal dust with Vaseline to make a new lash color for his sister Mabel. Her homemade success gave birth to the name Maybelline, turning a kitchen experiment into a global cosmetics brand. A powerful gust on the Empire State Building's observation deck in 1942 whips this woman's skirt upward as her companion grabs her to keep her steady. For passing photographers, the city's highest viewpoint suddenly turned into an unplanned snapshot of wartime New York romance and wind. In April 1916, Dr. Granikov stands in a rowboat holding up a trench grenade, about to go carp fishing the hard way. On many World War I fronts, officers and soldiers quietly used extra munitions like this to stun fish between battles. In 1994, newly elected Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko covers his face and appears to cry in Parliament while a deputy reads a report about alleged abuses in his circle. The newspapers ran this image under the headline, "Tears of the President." In 1944, a U.S. Navy submarine crew reaches out to rescue a young pilot, George Bush, from a life raft after his plane was shot down near Chichijima. The soaked aviator on the waves would later become the 41st President of the United States. In 1920, these 7 soldiers pose side by side in Siberia, representing the United States, Canada, Britain, China, Italy, Czechoslovakia, and Japan. They were part of the little-known Siberian intervention, when foreign armies briefly occupied Russia's Far East to guard railways. This small dome gas station in New York in 1921 fuels early cars while a rail tank wagon rumbles past above. Within a few decades, simple curbside pumps like this would grow into giant branded gas chains, shaping every road trip map. Sports commentators sit in a narrow trench at the edge of the field, just their heads and microphones above the grass so they do not block the crowd's view. Early stadiums often built these sunken boxes to hide broadcasters, turning live commentary into a job done almost underground. In 1961 in New York, a researcher stands inside a huge wired model showing how signals from the eye and ear travel into the human brain. This strange science fiction-like exhibit at an American Medical Association meeting turned new ideas about control. In July 1944, Adolf Hitler stands in the shattered conference hut at his East Prussian headquarters, inspecting the scene of the briefcase plot that went off minutes earlier. The blast took the lives of 4 officers standing near the table, while he escaped with burst eardrums, burns, and a ripped uniform. This towering control box in Cleveland in 1914 is often called the first electric traffic light, with red and green lenses managed by a person inside. From this small cabin, one operator could command the entire crossroads and start the age of organized car traffic. Soviet engineer V. Bugrov practices climbing down the ladder of a full-scale lunar module mock-up in the 1960s. This secret training was part of the USSR's abandoned plan to land a cosmonaut on the moon with the LK lander. In 1899, the Russian icebreaker Yermak, one of the world's first true polar icebreakers, carves a channel through the frozen Gulf of Finland to reach the stranded battleship General Admiral Apraksin. The rescue proved that a steel ship could smash its way through heavy sea ice. During the Great Florence Flood of 1966, residents used parked cars as makeshift bridges while muddy water from the Arno River filled the streets. The dark stain on the hotel wall marks how high the water climbed as it damaged thousands of artworks. A Soviet parachute tester in 1935 spreads his arms to show an experimental wingsuit that lets his whole body act like a small glider. Designers hoped these fabric panels would stretch a jump into a long, controlled flight instead of a straight drop. During the Los Angeles unrest in 1992, a man pushes a cart loaded with diapers past a store engulfed in flames. More than 5,000 buildings were damaged in those few days, and this photo turned one night of shopping into a symbol of a city on the edge. A German bomb falls toward Mamayev Kurgan in Stalingrad in 1942, caught mid-air by a camera in the attacking aircraft. This hill changed hands dozens of times during the battle, its soil so churned by blasts and metal that later builders found fragments with almost every shovel of earth. In February 1943 at Stalingrad, a Soviet soldier lights cigarettes for exhausted German prisoners of war in the snow. Days earlier, they had fought street by street. Now, a shared smoke marked the end of one of history's hardest battles. George Neeson, the inventor of the modern trampoline, set one up near the summit stones of a Giza pyramid and jumped for this photo in 1977. He spent decades staging stunts like this around the world to promote his spring-framed invention. German army troops kneel in a forest clearing during a Catholic Mass in 1941, just days before their campaign against the Soviet Union begins. The quiet service came on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land offensive in history, with over 3 million Axis soldiers moving east. Conservators in 1998 carefully repair the original Star-Spangled Banner, spread out on a giant table like a faded fabric field. This 30 by 42-foot flag flew over Fort McHenry in 1814 during a British bombardment and inspired the words of the United States national anthem. German soldiers pull a French soldier out of the Passchendaele mud in 1917, where trenches had turned into waist-deep glue. In this battle, the mud was so thick it swallowed men, horses, and even guns, forcing enemies to rescue each other just to keep them from sinking. Royal Navy sailors line up with metal pails beside a barrel marked grog to collect their daily rum ration aboard HMS King George V in the 1910s. This centuries-old taut tradition lasted until 1970, when it was finally ended over fears that even a small serving of spirits could disturb careful work on modern ships. By late 1940, British scrapyards looked like this, stacked with the twisted frames of German aircraft brought down during the Battle of Britain. Much of this metal was melted and turned into new Allied fighters, literally recycling the enemy's machines into fresh Spitfires and Hurricanes. Rows of moored river barges formed the floating work village, White Steamboat, at Strak-Holosy, Green Cape, in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1987. These linked vessels served as a temporary town for crews working near the Chernobyl zone, complete with cabins, kitchens, and offices all afloat on the river. This 1954 Department of Defense identity card lists Marilyn Monroe under her married name, Norma Jean DiMaggio. She used documents like this while touring overseas bases to perform for American service members at the height of her rising fame. In 1984, American pathologist Frederick Zugibe straps a volunteer to a cross-shaped support in his Rockland County lab to study the posture shown in Christian art. Sensors on the chest and arms let him show that this position can quickly weaken breathing and circulation, giving a new medical view on the famous story. On August 21, 1957, the Soviet R-7 rocket stands on the pad just before performing the first fully successful flight of an intercontinental booster. This towering launcher would soon send Sputnik into orbit and force the United States into a full-scale space race. This World War II U.S. paratrooper radio operator's kit shows main and reserve parachutes, an M1 Garand with bayonet, a Colt M1901 pistol, grenades, and demolition charges laid out with exact order. Beside the weapons lie his radio, compass, notebook, first aid items, and tools so he could land behind lines. In the 1950s, former aircraft giant Messerschmitt switched from building warplanes to tiny three-wheeled cabine-and-roller microcars like this one. The driver sat in tandem under a clear cockpit-style canopy, turning a quiet harbor road into a mini runway. Dozens of horse carts loaded with grain jam the streets of Sumy in the 1920s as farmers line up to meet Soviet delivery quotas. From above, the convoy looks like a slow-moving river of bread, feeding the new state one wagon at a time. In 1944, off the Philippines, a Japanese ship tries to hide under a jungle of palm branches and netting so it looks like part of the shoreline from the air. The tight ring of bomb splashes shows that Allied pilots still picked out the fake island and attacked it with precision. On a fine February 1953, British children surge into a candy shop on the first day that sweet rationing ended after 13 long post-war years. For many of them, this was their very first chance to buy as many chocolates as their pocket money allowed. Two crewmen ride in an open metal gondola slung under a British airship during a World War I patrol over the sea. Early airships carried small bombs and cameras like this, letting observers quietly search for enemy ships from hundreds of meters up. In 1944, a young woman in Mykolaiv climbs up with a crowbar to tear down a street sign bearing Adolf Hitler's name. As Soviet troops pushed west, many towns across Ukraine rushed to strip away these occupation-era names and restore their old streets. Residents of Leningrad crowd around a huge street map in 1944 as an official moves a marker westward to show the new front line. After surviving nearly 900 days of siege, people followed every centimeter of that shifting line, knowing it meant German forces were being pushed out of Eastern Europe. In 1935, German Air Force Chief Hermann Göring celebrates his lavish wedding to actress Emmy Sonnemann, with the country's ruler seated at the bridal table. The ceremony was treated like a state event and broadcast across Germany to showcase the regime's glamour on the eve of a darker decade. In 1898, Russian inventor Andrei Pilstrom tested this bizarre hybrid of airship and flapping wing glider, trying to row through the sky above the Russian Empire. Such experiments with lighter-than-air flying machines took place years before the Wright brothers' powered airplane left the ground. Residents of Leningrad embrace a Soviet soldier after the order announcing the end of the 872-day blockade is posted in January 1944. The lifting of the siege became a symbol of survival for a city that endured one of the longest and harshest blockades in modern history. East German workers and soldiers set the first prefabricated concrete blocks in place as the Berlin Wall rapidly rises in August 1961. Overnight, this barrier grew into a 155-kilometer border fortification that sealed East Berlin off from the west for nearly 3 decades. Cuban militiamen ride toward the coast as the Bay of Pigs invasion begins, April 1961. Within 3 days, they and the regular army crushed the 1,400-man U.S.-backed exile force and captured almost all of its fighters. By the late 1970s, the original 1923 Hollywood sign was so rusted and torn that several letters were barely standing on the hillside. In 1978, the city tore it down and rebuilt the famous landmark with new steel letters sponsored by Hollywood celebrities. Artist Andy Warhol shows the scars on his torso from the 1968 attack by writer Valerie Solanas in New York. Doctors revived him after his heart stopped, and he lived the rest of his life wearing a surgical corset. Future Prime Minister Winston Churchill spends his time off laying bricks at his Chartwell estate in 1928. He loved the craft so much he formally joined the Bricklayers Union that year, joking he turned out 200 bricks and 2,000 words a day. On the 30th of January 1947, King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia met 20th Century Fox executives at the Café de Paris. At the next table sat a young Marilyn Monroe, years before she became a global star. In 1923, Benito Mussolini sits in the front row at the International Feminist Congress in Rome as women speakers demand political rights. Within a few years, his regime would dissolve many women's organizations and roll back those same freedoms. German infantry trudge past a bogged-down elephant tank destroyer on the muddy Anzio front in Italy, March 1944. Only 89 of these 65-ton beasts were built, and many were lost not to enemy fire, but to breakdowns and getting stuck like this one. On the 30th of November 1939, Soviet leaders in Moscow sign a treaty with the puppet Finnish Democratic Republic just hours after starting the Winter War. This short-lived government, led by Otto Kuusinen, never ruled most of Finland, but served as a political cover for Soviet plans. President Harry Truman holds up the Japanese language instrument of surrender just days after it was signed aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, September 1945. With this document, World War II officially ended and the U.S. assumed occupation authority in Japan. Actor Reggie Nalder, who played the vampire Kurt Barlow in the 1979 adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot, poses with his full creature mask. The unsettling makeup took hours to apply and helped create one of television's most memorable TV monsters. Women in Rabat, Morocco, walk through the Medina in traditional djellabas and face veils in 1965. At that time, Moroccan cities were rapidly modernizing, but in many quarters, this centuries-old street style still shaped everyday life. Soviet tanks roll past a shattered rebel stronghold in Budapest after the Hungarian uprising is crushed in November 1956. In just 2 weeks of street fighting, the revolt was drowned, and over 200,000 Hungarians fled the country as refugees. Hitler Youth members throw un-German books into a bonfire in Salzburg, Austria, on 30th April 1938, just weeks after the Anschluss. Soon, coordinated purges across Nazi-controlled Europe destroyed hundreds of thousands of works by Jewish, socialist, and other banned authors. Romanian prisoners of war trudge past a Soviet truck near Stalingrad in the winter of 1942. Romania's shattered armies lost over 100,000 men here as the collapse of the Axis flanks helped seal the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. In 1883, the iron-bark George Roper ran aground on the reefs off Point Lonsdale, Victoria, instantly turning this quiet Australian beach into a shipwreck spectacle. The stranded three-master lay in the surf for weeks, while townspeople in dark coats and hats strolled out to calmly pose with the dying ship. Emerson School for Girls in Boston, 1850s, where daughters of merchants learned Latin, algebra, and penmanship under gas lamps instead of being kept at home. Just a decade later, many of these girls would live through the American Civil War. British troops file into a landing ship during the Suez Crisis, October 1956. Britain, alongside France and Israel, prepared this seaborne operation to retake influence over Nasser's newly nationalized Suez Canal. Experimental Flettner FL-265 helicopter on a test field in Germany, 1939. Built in only 6 examples for sea trials, this compact rotorcraft became one of the first helicopters designed to operate from warships and influenced later naval helicopter designs. A street pitchman shouts through a megaphone from a giant mock airplane, luring Muscovites into the third all-union Oso Avia Kim lottery in 1929. The aviation-themed lottery advertised 16,000 prizes worth 300,000 rubles to fund Soviet aviation and civil defense clubs. A U.S. Navy F-6F-3 Hellcat lines up to land on an aircraft carrier during the Gilbert Islands campaign in 1943. This rugged fighter would go on to claim around 5,000 opposing aircraft, more than any other U.S. Navy plane of the war. A Romani fortune teller's wagon in Sweden turned into a rolling billboard, 1947. Post-war traveling seers like this mixed roadside showmanship with personalized futures for curious passers-by. Central Grozny lies in ruins after the winter assault of the First Chechen War, Russia, 1995. Amid gutted apartment blocks and shattered streets, a lone trolleybus creeping along the surviving tracks shows how public transport resumed while the city still looked like a World War II battlefield. During a record blizzard in Washington, D.C., the roof of the Knickerbocker Theater collapsed mid-film on 29 January 1922. The disaster took 98 lives, injured over 130 people, and became the deadliest structural failure in the city's history. A Jewish field chaplain of the Imperial German Army poses in uniform in the 1910s, wearing a large Star of David pendant over his greatcoat. Germany had over 10,000 Jewish soldiers in World War I. Many served with rabbis like him attached directly to frontline units. A tiny Clark CA-1 bulldozer is squeezed into a Waco CG-4A glider, ready to be silently flown into Normandy with the 101st Airborne on D-Day. Weighing just 4,000 pounds, these airborne tractors rushed out of gliders to clear landing zones and build emergency airstrips behind German lines. An American sniper trains with a Springfield M1903 fitted with a bulky Warner and Swazi telescopic sight in 1917. Early U.S. sniper rifles like this were still experimental, with offset scopes that forced shooters to aim with their heads tilted awkwardly to the side. Italian Bersaglieri Man, an anti-tank gun in the desert during the Battle of El Alamein, Egypt, 1942. Their trademark plumed helmets, originally meant to make them visible while sprinting on foot, ended up as one of the most distinctive uniforms of any World War II unit. A student in Stamford grips a Van de Graaff generator during a post-war school physics show in 1948. The charged dome pumps thousands of volts into her body, making every hair on her head stand on end like a live science cartoon. In 1916, Russian soldiers pose in their newly issued Zelinsky-Kumant gas masks on the Eastern Front. Invented by chemist Nikolai Zelinsky with an activated charcoal filter, this design became one of the most effective protective masks of World War I and was quickly copied by other armies. Princess Elizabeth explains the engine of an Army vehicle to her mother, Queen Elizabeth, at a training depot in Camberley in 1945. The future monarch had just qualified as a driver mechanic in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, making her the only British ruler formally trained to strip and rebuild vehicle engines. A Swedish farmer in a protective suit pitches away hay that was contaminated by invisible fallout from the Chernobyl reactor over 1,000 kilometers away in 1986. Sweden was one of the first countries to detect the disaster when abnormal radiation alarms went off at its Forsmark nuclear plant. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, examines an Apollo command module at NASA's Johnson Space Center in 1977. 14 years after orbiting Earth 48 times in Vostok 6, she was studying the hardware of her former rivals at the height of the space detente. Young Italian partisans walked through newly liberated Milan in 1945, their trench coats barely hiding captured submachine guns. Many of these women had been couriers and saboteurs in the anti-fascist underground only weeks before the city rose against occupation forces. A former head of state walks through a Russian city in the early 1990s, while a little-known local official keeps close behind him. Within a decade, that quiet city official will become the country's next national leader. The Japanese super battleship Yamato erupts in a towering column of smoke as U.S. carrier aircraft hit her during Operation Tengo off Okinawa on 7 April 1945. Built as the largest battleship ever constructed, she was overwhelmed from the air before her huge guns could fire on the invasion fleet. In 1909, undercover Baltimore police officers pose in court with cloth masks over their faces to protect their identities. The unmasked man is a recently arrested suspect they had tracked for months on the city's streets. A Louisiana farm worker sits with his wife and 13 children in their wooden cabin in 1938. the youngest boys clutching lunch pails for a long day in the fields. Huge families like this were common in the rural South, where every extra pair of hands helped the household survive the hardships of the Great Depression. A Croatian Bosniak woman shows traditional Christian tattoos with crosses and sun symbols inked along her forearms and hands. For centuries in Bosnia and Herzegovina, such marks acted as both folk protection and a permanent badge of identity under Ottoman rule. Catapult seaplanes perch above the main guns of a cruiser at sea in 1942, ready for launch. These float planes were vital scouts in World War II, spotting targets far beyond the ship's horizon before being hoisted back aboard by crane. White teenagers protest outside a Montgomery school in 1963, opposing new rules to integrate black and white students. Their signs and Confederate flags show how strongly some locals resisted civil rights changes in the American South. A Soviet camel caravan plods along a German road on the approach to Berlin, March 1945. The Red Army used these hardy animals to haul shells and supplies when trucks bogged down in snow and ruined roads. A match factory worker in Tomsk listens to one of the Soviet Union's early radio broadcasts while calmly sipping tea, 1928. For many workers, headphones like these were their first window to news and music from far beyond Siberia. Russian servicemen are evacuated from the fighting around Grozny inside a military transport plane, Chechnya, February 3, 1995. Bandaged soldiers lie side by side on the floor as they are flown away from the devastated city. A Russian soldier stands guard beside armored vehicles in front of the shattered presidential palace in Grozny, 1995. The ruined concrete shell had become the stark symbol of the First Chechen War's destruction in the city center. Early vending machines selling chocolate, newspapers, and tobacco stand along the walls of Sokolniki metro station in Moscow. 1935. The Soviet subway debuted modern self-service technology just months after the system opened. American sailors from the cruiser USS Olympia Count captured Red Army soldiers on the railway platform at Bakharitsa, near Arkhangelsk, Russia, 6 September 1918. The prisoners had been taken in fighting along the Northern Front during the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. Prisoners in the Vorkuta labor camp sit in crowded wooden barracks at the end of World War II, 1945, USSR. Vorkutlag grew into one of the largest Arctic camp complexes, built around rich coal deposits north of the Arctic Circle. Sun Yaoting, the last imperial eunuch of China, sits with the abbot of a Beijing temple in 1994. Castrated as a boy to serve the Qing court and later Puyi, he outlived the dynasty by many decades and became a living link to the old empire. Valentina Tereshkova walks with Cuban leader Fidel Castro during her goodwill visit to Havana in 1963. Just weeks after becoming the first woman in space, she toured Cuba as a living symbol of the new space age. A woman arrested in Los Angeles in 1949 poses defiantly for a police photograph, still wearing her fur coat and garter. The image shows how post-war vice crackdowns collided with Hollywood-style glamour in everyday city life. A slim tornado funnel twists above the U.S. Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C., captured in a rare 1922 storm photograph. The unusual vortex damaged nearby trees and buildings, but left the Capitol itself largely untouched.